After Huor was killed in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, his wife Rian fled into the wild and was taken in by a group of grey elves. There she gave birth to her son Tuor, but being desperate for her husband, she left Tuor in the care of the elves and went to look for Huor. She found the Hoth in Nirnaeth, the mound on which all the slain were laid, and laid down there and died. Hurin also had a wife, Morwen, and they had 2 children, Turin and Lilith. Turin loved his little sister very much, but she was only 3 years old when a plague came out of Angband, and she died. Turin was 8 years old when the battle happened, and Morwen was pregnant again when the Easterlings came barging into Dorloman and took it over. They oppressed and enslaved the remnants of the House of Hador, but Morwen was so intimidating that none of the Easterlings dared touch her. They were still dirt poor, though, and Morwen was worried that they would eventually take Turin away from her. So she decides to send him to Thingol, because she was Baron's first cousin once removed, and Baron and Hurin had been friends once upon a time. So off Turin goes, accompanied by 2 old servants, and there began the incredibly tragic story of his life. Not long after Turin had left, Morwen gave birth to a baby girl, and she named her Nienor, which is mourning. Then Turin and his companions arrived in Doriath and were met by Beleg. Beleg took them to Thingol, and Thingol happily received Turin, taking him in as his own foster son, because his attitude toward men had finally chilled out. He then sent messengers to Dorloman inviting Morwen to come join her son, but Morwen, being the strong, independent woman that she is, refused to leave her home behind. She did, however, send a great heirloom for Turin to use as he grew older, the dragon helm of Dorloman. So Turin grew up in Doriath and became quite strong and handsome, although he was pretty much constantly sad thanks to the whole situation with his family. At first, messages came frequently from Dorloman with news about his mother and sister, so that made him feel a little better, but then the messengers stopped returning, and Thingol refused to risk sending any more. So Turin decides it's time to be a man, and he asks Thingol for weapons and armor. Putting on the helm his mother had sent, he went out to defend the borders of Doriath. He joined up with Beleg, and the two became very close friends. After spending 3 years out in the wild, Turin finally returned to Menegroth looking like a ragamuffin thanks to all the roughing it that he had been doing. Now there was this other elf named Seiros who was pretty close to Thingol, but he had always resented how much favor Turin had received. So when they're all sitting down to dinner, he starts to taunt Turin, saying, well, if this is how the men of Dorloman are, what a bunch of hussies the women must be. Turin is pretty naturally ticked, and he chucks his cup into Seiros' face, hurting him badly. So the next day, Seiros is even more furious, and he ambushes Turin in the woods. But Turin gets the upper hand, and to punish Seiros for his words, he forces him to run naked like a hunted animal. Things immediately get out of hand, however, because in his fear, Seiros runs off a cliff and gets killed. Then Mablung and a bunch of other elves show up and see what happened, and since Mablung understands that it was basically an accident, he tells Turin to come back to Menegroth and talk to Thingol. But Turin refuses, declaring himself an outlaw, and since he didn't want to get captured, he ran away out of Doriath and found a bunch of other outlaws who he joined up with. Once Thingol learned about the whole situation, he was more than ready to pardon Turin, and around this time Beleg also came back to Menegroth looking for his buddy. Thingol tells him about how Turin has run off, and he's like, I love Turin like my own son. Could you go bring him back, please? And Beleg readily agrees, since he also loved Turin, so he sets off into the wild and starts looking for him. Turin fits right in with the outlaws and eventually becomes their leader, operating under the alias of Nathan, which means the wronged. He had lived with them for a year until Beleg finally found their hideout. Turin was out when Beleg arrived, so the other outlaws grabbed him and tied him up, thinking that he was a spy. When Turin comes back and sees that it's his old friend, he's horrified and immediately feels bad for all the lawless stuff that he had been doing. So he and Beleg renew their friendship, and Turin promises to never again hurt anyone except the servants of Angband. So now Beleg is like, hey, Thingol wants you to come back, and I want you to come back, so come back already. But Turin inherited all of his mother's pride and stubbornness, so nothing Beleg says can convince him to return. He instead begs Beleg to stay with him, but Beleg is like, listen, if you're going to be unreasonable, then so am I, so if you want to find me, I'll be in Doriath. So Beleg leaves the next day and goes back to Menegroth, and he tells Thingol and Melian all about what happened. So Thingol is like, what am I going to do with that boy? And Beleg is like, let me go and keep an eye on him. Thingol agrees and offers Beleg to take anything he'd like with him. Beleg chooses the sword Anglachel, which was forged by the dark elf Aol from the metal of a fallen star. Thingol hands Beleg the sword, but he's like, there's a darkness in this sword, you'd better be careful with it. And Beleg is like, whatever, I'll make it work. Melian also gives Beleg some lembas bread for both himself and Turin, which was a big deal because never before had the elves ever shared their waybread with a mortal man. With these gifts, Beleg set out once again. Back at the Outlaws, however, Turin had decided to move their hideout because they wanted someplace safer. So they head west and come across 3 dwarves who ran away from them. One of the dwarves lags behind and the men catch it, and one of the men shoots an arrow after the 2 got away. The dwarf that they captured was named Mim, and he begged Turin for his life, promising to guide the outlaws into the hidden halls where he lived. So Turin took pity upon Mim and accepted his offer, following Mim to the hill of Amonruth and the tunnels inside of it. Once they get inside, however, one of the other dwarves greets Mim and they go off into the tunnels together. Turin follows them into a chamber and finds Mim and the other dwarf mourning a third dwarf who had died. So Turin is like, hey, is there anything I can do? And Mim is like, no you can't, my son just died from your man's arrow. So now Turin feels really bad and he promises to pay a ransom of gold to Mim if he ever comes into wealth, although he knows it wouldn't replace his son. So now Mim respects Turin and allows him and his dudes to stay in his house for as long as they want. And so Turin lives there in Ruth, and he and Mim start to become friends, sort of. But one cold winter's day, who should show up on their doorstep but Beleg? He had brought with him the dragon helm, hoping it would inspire Turin to be more than an outlaw, but even though Turin is very happy to see his friend, he still refused to go back to Doriath. So at last Beleg gives in and stayed there with Turin, and because of his prowess in battle and his skills as a healer, he became very renowned among the outlaws. Mim, however, was not at all pleased that an elf was now staying in his house, and he started being a recluse with his remaining son, but Turin didn't care much anymore. Springtime came and Morgoth started sending more of his orcs out into Beleriand, but Turin and Beleg are the dream team, and word of the bow and helm started to spread all around, and people started flocking to them. However, as a result of this, Morgoth learned the location of Hurin's son, and he began surrounding Ruth with his spies. So when autumn came, Mim and his son were out hunting for roots, and they got captured by orcs. Mim offers to lead them to Ruth in exchange for his life, but he demands that Turin be left alive, to which the orc captain laughingly agrees. So Mim leads them during the dead of night, and a bunch of men are slaughtered, but Turin is taken alive. Mim then creeps out to where all the bodies are, and he sees that Beleg is wounded but still alive. So Mim picks up Anglichel, but before he can use it, Beleg wakes up and takes the sword from him, and Mim runs off screaming into the woods. Beleg then patches himself up and starts looking for Turin's body so that he can bury him, but when he doesn't find it, he realizes that he must be alive. So Beleg sets out to find him once again, and while he's tracking the orcs, he suddenly runs across another elf. This elf is none other than Gwyndor, the elf of Nargothrond who was captured during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. He had escaped from the dungeons of Angband, but he was a shell of his former self. Gwyndor tells Beleg that he had seen a company of orcs pass by with a captive, and Beleg is like, hey, that's my guy. Gwyndor tries to convince Beleg to turn back, insisting that he'll just get captured himself, but Beleg refused to give up, and he manages to inspire Gwyndor to hope once again. So the two of them start tracking the orcs once again and find their camp in the middle of a thunderstorm. Beleg snipes all the wolf sentinels and they sneak in, finding Turin bound and unconscious. Beleg and Gwyndor finagle him out of the camp and lay him down a little ways away. Beleg uses his sword to cut Turin's bonds, but the blade slipped and pricked Turin's foot. He wakes up suddenly, and all he sees is someone leaning over him with a sword, so he attacks Beleg and takes his sword, killing him. Lightning strikes and lights up the clearing, and Turin realizes what he's done. Despite Gwyndor's attempts to get him to move and flee, Turin stays beside Beleg's body, silent and unmoving. Morning comes and the orcs go back to Angband, believing that all trace of Turin's escape would have been washed away in the storm. Gwyndor finally manages to rouse Turin, and they bury Beleg with his bow, but Gwyndor took Anglichel and the Limbus bread with them. He then began to lead Turin to safer lands, but Turin never spoke, blindly following wherever Gwyndor guided him. At last they reached the pools of Ivren, a lake which was guarded from defilement by the power of Ulmo. Turin drank from the pool and was finally able to grieve, singing a song in remembrance of his dear friend. Gwyndor then handed Anglichel to Turin and tells him his name, promising to guide him to Nargothrond. Since Gwyndor was in the dungeons of Angband, Turin asks if he ever saw Hurin. Gwyndor says, no, I didn't, but I heard a rumor that Morgoth has laid a curse on all his kin. And Turin says, yeah, no kidding. Then they journeyed down south to Nargothrond and were captured by scouts, and thus came inside the stronghold. At first, Gwyndor's own people didn't recognize him, but King Orodreth's daughter Finduilas did, because they had long been in love with each other. Since he was with Gwyndor, Turin was let into Nargothrond, and since he didn't want anyone to know his real name, he gave himself the most angsty name you could ever think of. Agarwain, son of Umarth, or Bloodstained, son of Ill Fate. Turin begins to rise in popularity at Nargothrond thanks to his great skill in battle, and he has that tall, dark, and handsome thing going on too, so Finduilas actually starts falling in love with him, but she's feeling sort of torn because she still cares for Gwyndor. Gwyndor, however, notices the change in her behavior, and he's like, hey baby, I want you to be happy, but be careful, because this guy is actually Turin, son of Hurin, and he and his kin are all screwed. But all Finduilas says in response is, it doesn't matter, he will never love me anyway. Eventually, however, she tells Turin about this, and he goes to Gwyndor all like, hey bro, I thought we had something special, why you gotta go and summon my doom onto me? And Gwyndor's like, buddy, the doom is on you whether people know your name or not. Once Orodreth learns of Turin's true identity, though, he just honors him more, since the great feats of Hurin were very well known. Turin then convinces Orodreth to stop all the sneaky stabby attacks that they had been doing, and to march openly to war once more. All the orcs and evil things are driven out to the realms surrounding Nargothrond, but as a result, Morgoth finally discovers where it is. Meanwhile, Morwen and Turin's sister Nienor have finally come to Doriath, only to find that Turin wasn't even there, but they stay there as guests of Thingol and Melian nonetheless. Then two messengers come to Nargothrond bringing news of a gigantic host of orcs that Morgoth is sitting in their way, led by Glaurung the dragon. The smart thing to do would have been to shut themselves up in Nargothrond and hold out, but Turin wants to go out in the open and fight like a man, so Urjeth agrees and the armies of Nargothrond march out to battle. As it turns out, Morgoth's army is freaking huge, and all the elves of Nargothrond get wrecked. Urjeth is killed and Gwyndor mortally wounded, but Turin carries him away from the battle and he's like, I got you homie, we'll get out of this, but Gwyndor is like, it's too late bro, I love you, but I also kinda regret saving you, so go save my girlfriend at least. So Turin runs back to Nargothrond, but the orcs and Glaurung are already there, taking over the place. Glaurung comes out the doors and he's like, sup, and when Turin tries to attack, Glaurung puts a spell on him, freezing him in place. Then Glaurung is like, you suck in just about every way possible, and you know what, your mom and sister are living in misery while you've been living like a prince. Your father would be so disappointed. Since Turin is trapped under the dragon's spell, he's just like, wow, I do suck. And then all the orcs go by, dragging Finduilas with them. She cries out to Turin, but he isn't able to do anything, and she gets taken away. Finally, Glaurung releases Turin from his enchantment, and he's like, see, look how merciful I am, go on and run home. And Turin, believing the dragon's lies, takes off for Dorloman to supposedly save Morwen and Nienor. He gets to Dorloman, but sees that Morwen's house is empty, and nobody knows where she's gone except for Aerin, Morwen's cousin. Now Aerin had been married to Brada, the Easterling lord, so Turin barges into their house and demands to know where Morwen is. Aerin explains that they went to Doriath, and Turin finally realizes that Glaurung was lying. Now thoroughly ticked, he kills Brada and a bunch of other Easterlings and then flees out of Dorloman, once again a hunted man. He considers going to join his mother and sister, but he decides to leave them safely in Doriath and not trouble them with his seemingly cursed presence. So instead he goes looking for Finduilas and comes to the woods of Brethil. He meets some of the men who live there, remnants of the House of Haleth, and he rescues them from some orcs. They ask him to come back with them, but Turin says he's looking for Finduilas. Dorlas, the leader of the men, tells him that the men of Brethil tried to save the captives of Nargothrond, but they did not succeed, and Finduilas is already dead. Turin demands to see her grave, and while he's mourning her, Dorlas and the others put two and two together and realize that this must be the legendary Black Sword of Nargothrond, aka Turin, son of Hurin, so they take him back home. The ruler of the men of Brethil was a gentleman named Brandir, who had been lame since childhood and had no desire for war. When he sees Turin, he gets a real bad feeling, but he feels sorry for him, so he takes him in. Turin then decides to stay and live with the men of Brethil, hoping he can leave his past behind him. As a token of his new life, he gives himself the most edgy name you could ever think of, Turambar, Master of Doom. Back in Doriath, news has come of the ruin of Nargothrond, and it becomes known that Turin was there, but nobody knows whether he's now dead or alive. Morwen is naturally distraught, and despite Melian's protests, she takes off to go find him. Thingol sends Mablung an escort of elves after her, but they tell Nienor that she has to stay behind. Nienor, however, is a strong independent woman, so she disguises herself and sneaks into Mablung's company. They find Morwen and try to convince her to come back, but she refuses, and then they find out that Nienor is there, and Morwen tries to convince her to go back, and finally Mablung is like, I cannot deal with you people, we're all just going. So they draw close to Nargothrond, and Mablung goes ahead with some scouts, but Glaurung becomes aware of what they're doing, so he heats himself up and jumps in the river, making a bunch of steam that blinds Mablung and his company, getting them completely lost. Then Glaurung makes his way towards the hill where Morwen, Nienor, and some guards are waiting. The guards see him coming, and they're ready to cut and run, but his steam comes up and everyone gets separated. Morwen vanishes into the wild, but Nienor makes her way back to the rock. And who should be waiting for her but Glaurung? They have a really intense staring contest, but Glaurung wins out, putting a spell on her that was similar to what he did to Turin, but in her case he just erases her memory and keeps her from moving or speaking or seeing or hearing or anything. In this state, Mablung finds her, and he tries to safely lead her back to Doriath, but they get attacked by orcs and Nienor runs into the wilderness. Being unable to find Morwen either, Mablung is forced to return to Doriath without either of them. Nienor's flight finally brings her to Brethil, where Turin finds her naked in the woods. He doesn't know her since he had never seen his sister, but he takes her in and cares for her. Since she couldn't remember anything, including her own name, Turin calls her Niniel, Tear Maiden, for how she was weeping when he found her. She comes to live with the people of Brethil, and they teach her how to speak again, and Brandir heals her when she falls sick of a fever. He falls in love with her, but she's in love with Turin because she doesn't know that that's her brother, and he starts falling in love with her too. Brandir tells Nienor not to marry Turin because he has a really bad feeling, but eventually they get married anyway, and Nienor gets pregnant because... Alright. Then Glaurung shows his ugly mug again, and all the people of Brethil look to Turin to protect them, because a lot of them had started to respect him more than they respected Brandir. So Turin devises a plan to take the dragon down and leaves out, accompanied by Dorlas and another man, Hunthor. Nienor is feeling really anxious and stressed out, so she finally takes off after Turin, and several others follow her. Brandir is like, oh my gosh you guys, this is stupid, stop, but nobody listens to him, and finally he's like, screw you all, I'm done being your ruler. And having nothing left but his love for Nienor, he tries to go after her, but thanks to his bum leg, he falls behind. Turin finds out that Glaurung is on a cliff on the other side of a gorge, and he decides to cross over the rapids to go get him. He and Hunthor make it across, but Dorlas chickens out and hides in the woods. While Turin and Hunthor are climbing up the cliff, a stone falls and kills Hunthor, but at last Turin makes it up and drives his sword all the way into Glaurung's belly. Glaurung screams and thrashes about all over the place, throwing himself all the way across to the other side of the gorge. Turin crosses the river again, wanting to get his sword back, and before he pulls it out he's like, yeah, take that, you ugly worm, that's what you get for ruining my life. He yanks out the sword, but a spurt of blood comes with it, and it burns Turin's hand. Then Glaurung opens his eye and literally death glares him, causing Turin to pass out. So Glaurung's screams were heard all throughout the forest, and Nienor freezes in place, the sound of the dragon's voice filling her with a dark fear. Finally, Brandir finds her and he's like, hey, come along, I'll get you out of here so we won't die. So he starts leading her away. After a little while, however, Nienor starts to think again, and she's like, hey, wait, where are we going? And Brandir's like, somewhere safe? And she's like, excuse me, I need to find my husband, what were you thinking? So she takes off again, and Brandir is just left to hobble after her. She finds Turin lying unconscious next to Glaurung, and she binds up his hand and begs him to wake up. Then Glaurung stirs for the last time and releases her from the spell, causing her to remember everything. Unable to cope with this revelation, Nienor runs away and jumps into the rapids below, and is never found by anyone again. Brandir unfortunately witnessed all that, and he starts going back to where all the people of Brethil are gathered. Along the way, he finds Dorlas still hiding in the woods, they argue, and Brandir kills him, the first and last blood that he ever spilled. Then he finally makes it back, and the people are like, did you see where Niniel went? And Brandir's like, Niniel is dead, the dragon is dead, and Turambar is also dead, and good riddance. So now everyone is sad, but then Turin shows up, having finally awakened. He has no idea what's happened, but he sees that someone tinted his hand, so he's a little confused. All the people are scared when they see him, thinking he's a ghost, but Turin is like, no guys, I'm alive, hey, where's my wife? And Brandir's like, she's dead, but Dorlas's wife is like, don't listen to him, he's crazy, he just said you were dead and that it was a good thing. So now Turin is angry, and he and Brandir start yelling at each other, and Brandir is like, she was your sister, you sicko, Glaurung was right, you are cursed. And Turin's like, shut up, you liar! And he kills Brandir, then runs off into the woods. He comes to Finduilas's grave, and he's just questioning his whole life, unable to decide whether he should go to Doriath or just go and find death in battle. Then who should stumble across him but Mablung and pals, and Mablung is like, hey man, you're alive, it's great to see you! But Turin is like, shut up, just tell me where my mother and sister are. Mablung reluctantly tells Turin the truth, that Morwen was lost in the wild, and that Nienor had lost her memory before she also disappeared. And Turin realizes that Brandir was telling the truth, and he just murdered a man for no reason. And also he was married to his sister. So he just starts laughing like a crazy person and runs off. The elves try to follow him, but he completely outruns them. Finally he comes to the cliff where Nienor jumped, and he takes out his black sword and stabs himself. Mablung and the others find him, and some of the men of Brethil show up too, and once everyone knows the whole truth, they're all horrified. But alas, they gathered up a bunch of wood and burned Glaurung's body to ash, and then they buried Turin with his sword and set up a memorial for the children of Hurin.